All right, let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum organized by the MIT Mobility Initiative. My name is Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. Today, I'm really glad to have Stephanie Pollack and Jamey Tesler join us for a conversation on creating the mobility innovation system, the state and the private sector roles. In today's environment, there's a lot of debate on the state capacity. There seems a tendency to overvalue the federal government and undervalue the state and the local. And today, we actually want to emphasize the state and local government. Another important aspect is that ecosystem building is very well understood. But today, we really try to bring the two concepts together to look at how state and local government combined with the innovative business sector, how they play a role together as an ingredient for the mobility innovation. Stephanie will offer a deep dive on the state capacity and how and what is required for sustainable mobility. And Jamey will elaborate on the role of business innovation at the local level. We hope together to generate a discussion on affirmative, proactive way to continue the pursuit of a goal of sustainability and infrastructure development at the state and local level. Let me emphasize the norm of this forum, which is everyone, particularly the audience, to contribute one idea, either in the form of a comments or question to Jamey or Stephanie. You can type it directly into the chat. Right? I also want to do, given the topic is about the different stakeholders, how do we collaborate in this ecosystem? I do want to do a small poll here. Just describe your role. I separate between federal versus state and the local government in order to make the point of the difference between the two. Okay, let me give a few seconds. 80 people participated so far, 90, 100. Okay, 5 more seconds. I will stop. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, 120 people participate. I'll end the poll and share the result. Stephanie and Jamey, who you can see, 10% federal government, 34% state and municipal, 26% industry, 1% NGO, 16% researchers, others. Great. Oh, thank you. Nice. Good. Let me introduce both the panelists today. Both of them have a rich leadership experience. Stephanie recently served as the senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, particularly on the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the BIL. And before that, he was 6 years as the secretary and the CEO of Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and 2 years as the deputy and acting administrator of the Federal Highway Administration in the U.S. DOT. Jamey founded the Mass Mobility Hub and worked as the executive director, which aims to advance sustainable transportation solution by creating a dynamic ecosystem that fosters collaboration, innovation, and economic growth in the Commonwealth and beyond. Prior to that, he was also a former Massachusetts Secretary of Transportation and a former registrar of the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicle. Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Stephanie and Jamey. Please.
Great, thanks very much. And we're both delighted to be here, and we're going to sort of trade off. We're going to try to cover a little bit of an overview on what we mean when we talk about a mobility innovation ecosystem. Then I'm going to talk about the state role. Jamey will talk about innovation, and then we'll sort of trade off on the conclusions and leave lots of time for what we know will be a great discussion. So I often use this image. This is from the 1964 World's Fair from GM's Futurama, and it is specifically an image of what at that time they thought 2024 would look at. So it's kind of interesting to now be in 2025, looking back. And I don't think that's the world that we live in. And I'm not sure it's the world most of us would want to live in, but it just helps us all remember to be a little bit humble when it comes to predicting where innovation is going to take us. And while we probably can do without flying cars, although I know some people are working on that, we do need a mobility ecosystem, which means a system at primarily the local metro regional level where people have really good options to get where they need to go. And also we have to remember, we also have to move goods as well as people sustainably. These are some pictures from my recent trip to the Netherlands, which has been working really hard at creating that kind of ecosystem that involves buses and trams and bikes. People always think of bikes, but I remind people there's cars everywhere in the Netherlands. It's not like they've excluded cars from that ecosystem, and they're constantly experimenting with new technology right now. E-bikes that they call fat bikes and microcars are both being introduced into that mobility ecosystem in the Netherlands. So I'm going to actually hand off to Jamey for a moment to talk about what's going on in the U.S.
So great to be here, and appreciate getting a chance to contribute to this conversation. And as Jinhua noted, one of the things we hope to do is bring two pretty good, well-understood areas, both on state capacity and also on how ecosystems are built, but unite them and fuse them in a conversation to really stimulate the discussion about how we move forward. And as recent forums here on Friday have discussed, and I won't elaborate on too much, we know that we haven't seen too much innovation in transportation, particularly in our major modes, over the last few decades. At the same time, what we are seeing in the US is the roots and potential for significant transformation in mobility in a lot of different zones. This picture captures that. We can move on. What many of you know in innovation terms is familiar with in the upper right-hand corner is the traditional S-curve of innovation, how we go from the start of innovation to it accelerates exceedingly fast until we get to really a point of dramatic change. In the lower left, you see a pretty well understood but important S-curve on other nations where they are with EV adoption. You can see we're still in the flat part here in the United States. We have many areas of potential transformation in our mobility system that we saw in Stephanie's slide from the Netherlands, but we are in that flat part of the curve. And the question today is really, how do we combine these two schools of thought and accelerate up that S-curve? Lastly, we're going to focus on, as the next slide shows, two elements of a full ecosystem. All these contribute, but we're going to really drill in on the state and local and the role of the private sector today.
So I'm going to talk about the state role. And one of the important things to emphasize is that while state departments of transportation are really important, there's a lot of different agencies operating at the state and local level beyond state DOTs. In the United States, there are, for example, over 1,000 bus-based transit systems. There are over 6,000 local entities that run demand response transportation. In terms of sort of who owns our assets, the states actually only own about 20% of the road miles in the United States of America, including the entire interstate system. People think the interstates are federal roads. They are federally funded roads, but they are owned by the states. But over 75% of all the roadways in the US are actually owned by cities, towns, and counties. So local public works departments, transit agencies, tribal nations, they're all an important part when we talk about state and local, not just state departments of transportation. And the other sort of I think misunderstanding that a lot of folks have is that the federal government is sort of where most of the spending comes from. And I don't want to underplay the importance of having a federal partner as part of the transportation mobility ecosystem in the United States. We need the federal government to remain a partner, a funding partner, and an innovation partner, as well as a regulatory partner. But as the left-hand graph shows, the federal government, even with the increase that you see at the very right side of the slide in revenue coming from the bipartisan infrastructure law, which provides about $675 billion for transportation, just for transportation in the 5 years between 2022 and 2026, the feds represent actually just under half of all the revenue. And because federal revenue is actually allocated down to state DOTs and transit authorities, when you look at the right-hand graph, right, the red line is state and local expenditures, and the blue line way down at the bottom is federal expenditures. So in terms of who is actually building out the transportation ecosystem in the United States, the answer is the state and local governments, even when they are using federal funding to do so. So they're important. But that's not the only thing state and local governments do. They play a lot of different roles. They are revenue raisers. 32 states have raised new transportation revenue just since 2012. They're our first line on safety issues. They are the builders of our projects, whether they're using their own money or federal money or other money. And as I said, they own, plan for, and maintain most of the forms of transportation infrastructure in this country, everything from roads and traffic signals and crosswalks and bridges to rolling stock and tracks for transit and rail. And then finally, there's almost no federal role for zoning, land use, and economic development, which are inextricably intertwined with the transportation ecosystem. So it's not an exaggeration to say that despite the importance of the federal partner, there's still a lot of very positive momentum around innovation that can occur, even at a time when maybe the federal government is going to recede a little bit. The state and local governments are already stepping up. So I want to briefly, to sort of spur the conversation, talk about 3 areas in which state and local government is already beginning to step up and play a greater role in the evolving mobility ecosystem. And those 3 areas are getting away from just roads into a more multimodal approach to the infrastructure that they build and maintain. And then the second bucket I want to talk about is the state and local role in charging and sustainable fueling, which is a critical part if we're going to have a sustainable mobility ecosystem in the future. And then finally, where does technology-enabled transportation come in, and what is the state and local role there? So first, let's talk about multimodal infrastructure. So in order to get to a ecosystem where there's a lot of different options for moving people and goods, there's going to need to be more innovation at the state and local level in terms of how we build infrastructure, in particular, how we build safe infrastructure, and how we think about multiple users who are not only traveling in different modes, but from a safety perspective, a really critical part is that they are traveling at different speeds, right? So if you want to sort of speed separate modes, then it's not just enough to sort of lump walking and biking together. You might need separate walking and biking, as you see in the upper left-hand corner. You need to think about bikes vis-a-vis transit. You need to think buses vis-a-vis cars. And one of the issues that's coming up repeatedly, particularly at the local level, is access to the curb, right? You can put a bus lane next to the curb. You can put parking next to the curb. You can put a bike lane next to the curb. You can put pick-up drop-off for Uber and Lyft next to the curb. There's only so much curb. And that really is an exclusively local issue. But the ability to innovate around different transportation modes does depend on access to both travel lanes and the curb, which is locally controlled. The second bucket I want to talk about is fueling. For the internal combustion engine-based transportation system, the truth is there was not historically a big governmental role in creating the fueling ecosystem, but for electrification, that's different. And so we need to be able to charge cars. We also need to be able to charge transit buses, and we also need to think about the heavy duty engines that power airplanes and ships, and what role you're going to have to the government is going to have to play. So this is a new role for state DOTs. Jinhua mentioned that there's concern about capacity. I just showed you a slide in which the state DOTs and the locals are already doing a lot of things, and when you start to and at least the physical infrastructure piece is sort of a logical extension from building out roads. But I think what we have found, was certainly what I saw in the 4 years I was at federal DOT, is we had the first federal funding for fueling infrastructure. The process of getting the states to be the builders, owners, and maintainers of fueling infrastructure has been more complicated and unrolled more slowly than I think we had hoped. It's not the same sort of relatively straightforward leap from building roads to building bike lanes. And then the third bucket, and one of the most exciting from an innovation perspective, but again, one where the capacity of state and local government to be a player in this space is going to be stretched, is what I call technology-enabled parts of the mobility ecosystem. The system is increasingly complicated. The system is increasingly congested. We know that technology has the potential to really address those issues. Technology in the form of transit signal priority, technology in the form of using artificial intelligence to change bus routes to reduce travel times, which the MBTA has been experimenting with, better communication, vehicle to everything or V2X technology, intelligent traffic signals, so Bluetooth-enabled traffic signals that can be managed dynamically instead of by somebody climbing up a pole and using a screwdriver to change signal timing, and autonomous vehicles. These are all really important parts of the transportation innovation ecosystem. The federal government has been pushing on these, but increasingly local and state government have been early adopters, important players. In fact, AASHTO, the Trade Association for State DOTs, just testified before Congress earlier this week about wanting to see more funding move down to the state level for the technology piece of the build out of our mobility ecosystem. So a lot of exciting things going on. So the last thing I want to talk about before turning it over to Jamey is do we actually have a structured way of accelerating innovation in any of these spaces? In other words, climbing that S-curve faster with state DOTs. So I just want to highlight a program that the Federal Highway Administration has been running for the last about 15 years called Everyday Counts. And it was originally conceived as a program for climbing that innovation S-curve with respect to project construction. That's why it's called Everyday Counts, the idea that, every day you can shorten up the construction period for building something. But the truth is the program has expanded. It's a very structured program. There's a process by which the states and federal highway work together to identify innovations. And the goal here is to take innovations that some states are using, so they're mature enough that there's a high degree of confidence that they're ready for prime time, right? So usually at least 4 to 10 states are using an innovation like internally cured concrete or improving nighttime visibility for safety or doing traffic incident management differently, 3 of the 4 innovations that are part of the current cycle. But then there's a very structured process whereby state DOTs actually sign up and commit to participating for 1 or more of the innovations, and there's a 2-year cycle. And a lot of the teaching is actually done by the state DOTs that have adopted the innovation. And so the lessons I think we can all learn as we think about accelerating innovation at the state and local level from the Everyday Counts is, so first of all, it works best if the innovation is in use on the ground in some places. So the goal, and literally Federal Highway sets numerical goals. They'll say 9 states are using internally cured concrete. We want to get to 31 in 2 years. The states actively choose specific innovations that they're going to commit to sending staff to participate in. States really like to learn from other states. So it's not mostly academics or even federal staff teaching. It is mostly state officials who have already adopted the innovations. There is a track record over 15 years where you can see for each of the innovations that's been used, the increase in the number of states, and it's substantial. And then finally, there's now sort of an archive, right? So all the materials that are developed from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th rounds of this remain archived in a library that's available to all 50 states. So even if you didn't sign up for an innovation in EDC 6, and now your state is interested in it, you can sort of self-teach. So you end up with this archive of dozens of innovations. So it's just a great model that I think we can think about when we think about the issue of how do we help state and local agencies innovate faster. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jamey to talk about the innovation ecosystem and the private sector.
Thanks, Stephanie. So as we talked about earlier, we want to really combine these two different areas of learning. And so we want to get into a little bit of what is pretty established thinking about how to build successful innovation clusters in regions and in sectors of the economy, and how we can take that to how we can take that to unlock and unleash some of the benefits in local and state areas for mobility. So again, here, this is where we're going to focus for this part of the conversation. If we can go on to the next slide. So wanted to use an example, and so I picked one that sort of is close to home for us, as we are sort of virtually and practically in the MIT community here. There are 5 pretty established lessons that, whether you're talking about building a cluster like Silicon Valley, here in the case of life sciences, there's many across the sort of domain and learning about how you build a positive feedback loop in the in a particular sector and ecosystem. But really today we want to match this up into the world of transportation. Here, these 5 lessons again are pretty established. If we can go to the next slide. The fun story that we want to talk about is, obviously, innovation is really not predictable, and it's important as we think about how to apply that to mobility. Here, in the case of Kendall Square and MIT, originally the plan was this was going to be a center for NASA. That didn't really work out. That became the train station and Volpe Center as we evolved. That's the next slide. And this is today the building that, because after a recent deal between MIT and the federal government, there's a beautiful new home for the Volpe Center here in Kendall Square. Late breaking and not even able to be added to this deck today, but to add to the story, on the same site, Biogen, one of the iconic life sciences companies here in Cambridge, is building their new headquarters to be open in a few years. So the story continues, and the point just is that sometimes, the best laid plans, we're going to start NASA, end up with both Volpe and a beautiful new building, but also this picture here of a really dense cluster that has grown around life sciences. Proximity matters is lesson 2, and again, enabling the unexpected and unpredictable benefits of innovation. If we can go to the next slide. The separate part, which is more about predictability and really important for, as we talked about, things like the curb, electrification, and really building end-to-end systems that can work and unleash change in our streets for both safety and sustainability. Predictable permitting regimes really matter. This is about the first of its kind life safety ordinance, life sciences safety ordinance that unleashed labs that really have helped us here in Cambridge unlock a series of innovations that have made profound impact, both economically and, more importantly, medically for many of us. But that is a very applicable lesson to how we think about and work with state and local government to unlock change, is having clear and fast systems on permitting. We can move to the next slide. And a really important lesson, and I think a really important point to connect up with one of the slides that Stephanie showed earlier, is industry can't do this alone. This is a signing of a economic development bill back in 2009. There was $1 billion invested in our life sciences industry here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts over the last series of years. You can see the job growth, and that's locally. And there's a greater story about what that has unleashed, benefits worldwide. We can do the same in other sectors, but it requires that local focus and investment and that partnership. And again, it matches up with the slide Stephanie showed about where the vast, not the vast majority, but a majority of the resources comes for state and local government, is still at that level for the infrastructure and mobility system. Next slide. So take a different perspective just to talk about what we see in the sort of business sector when we talk about mobility innovation. All of us hear constantly, deservingly so, about the profound changes and possibilities of AI, and lots identify as AI businesses. Many businesses are focused on the climate or climate tech sector, depending on how you want to call it, or sustainability. And there's profound changes happening in robotics. At the center of those three circles is really where mobility is. Any change is going to impact all of these zones. Any possibility of innovation, both from a business perspective, from a government perspective, is really in the heart of that. The next slide is a different way to imagine it. And these are just some of the verticals or some of the different sectors that we see in this industry, all of which are innovating at their own rate, all of which have their own S-curve, like I showed earlier in the slide presentation today. The key is that each of these sectors can really be unlocked and can grow and have the possibility to accelerate up that curve. But we are also in a significant worldwide competition for each of these sectors. So using the methodology that we showed earlier in the slides here, ecosystem building is really important in thinking of these areas. So they each have their own needs. They each have their own permitting and testing and demonstration needs, and they also need their own support and other connections and regional connections. The example we wanted to use, and this is from an actual working group that my organization, Mass Mobility Hub, has used, is how do you apply it to a specific sector from the vertical slide before? So we took these lessons, looked at them here. We set up a business and working group. There was a critical permitting law passed here in Massachusetts to accelerate for certain usage, including in the utility grade battery sector. We looked at, can we find and identify sites for early test and demonstrations? Do we need shared pilot and manufacturing and testing sites? And how do we connect that up with resources in a recently passed bill here in Massachusetts to invest in the sector? If you go to the next slide. So again, we are talking today about not ideas that are future, but things that are really present. These are two examples just to apply specifically the prior slide. In New York State, underway is a flagship project for a shared use battery site that is a merger between a variety of state, business, academic interests, and also something that is already built and working. It has been for a few years in Indiana. Both these sites enable day one startups to be able to build their very first fuel cells even before they're sample ready or funding ready. This is just the example of the kind of work to build specific innovation and ecosystems we're seeing across the United States, and also something that we were, as I showed on the previous slide, are really discussing and looking at here as a business community in Massachusetts. Next slide. So a couple just lessons to draw that out more generally away from the battery sector. What's distinct about transportation mobility that I think we all know, but is important to really stress as we think about this today, is we really do need to demonstrate, test, experience these things in physical places. And that really differs both whether you're in the battery or autonomy, electrification, micromobility, water, air, sea, we can keep going. But it also really distinguishes it from other sectors, whether it's software, life sciences, robotics. We really do need physical test environments, and as Stephanie covered very well, many of those need curb and many of those need street. And so the partner that is critical is going to be state and local agencies, and the private sector identify those right spaces. The second lesson that we continue to learn here is, and it's a real balancing act, is that to unleash sort of the business sector's innovation, we do need to provide the opportunity for these ideas to germinate and grow. The unpredictability of innovation that I discussed earlier is a key factor. And we don't want to apply too aggressively or too early all of our policy predispositions. We do need to enable the innovators to innovate and to learn from the ideas before they're really ready for the public domain. The last is, and this is something that we didn't cover in too much detail here, but there are limits when it comes to public grant models. And we do need to find and fill gaps with some of the other key contributors to really building and unlocking innovation, both on the academic and philanthropic side. There's a number of different ways we can rethink that model, and there are ways to that have been really successful in other zones.
So just want to sum up some conclusions and then turn it back over to Jamey. So the thing about the high functioning mobility innovation ecosystem is partnerships. Partnerships are really the drivers. There are lots of, that's what all these dotted circles are. There are lots of different ways, but what partnerships fundamentally do is encourage, enable, and empower both innovators and their ideas. And many of those partnerships are going to increasingly involve state and local government as the owners of the travel infrastructure, as the owners of the curbs, as players in both the technology and the fueling space. And so the ecosystem works best when it's not just those individual gray circles, each pursuing their own innovation or mobility agenda, but when we're working together in partnership. And Jamey's just going to quickly present one example of that.
So again, we showed some examples earlier in the sort of battery space about specific partnerships that are working. I think many in this MIT forum are familiar with, but there is tremendous work being done in a few places, both across the country and other places globally. Calling out here, a good example that is getting participation and work and contributions from a lot of different levels in Michigan at Michigan Central, including working closely with the city for permitting and testing zones. The next slide is just the organization that I have helped start, which is really using a very similar model here in Massachusetts. And I think one of the things that we feel strongly about and is really important to, again, distinguish the transportation mobility sector is we really think this is a coordinated effort, not a competitive effort. Innovation in this sector, very similar to the everyday counts model. We really do need to learn from different environments, different urban environments, different streets require different solutions. And succeeding in one city or succeeding in one region with a demonstration or pilot is just the beginning. And so coordinating innovation and building clusters where different subsectors can grow, test, and experience. For instance, as you look at this slide, water transportation is a great thing to succeed here, which might not be ideal for, other states and other examples that we have used today. There are ways that we can coordinate this innovation sector. And again, the need for physical environments to test and demonstrate, grow, get data, depending on the subsector you're part of, is why there is a network effect that's really vital for all of us to learn from each other, to grow from each other, and to actually adopt some of the lessons learned from everyday counts, which is why we wanted to call that out.
So I hope that we've stimulated folks thinking about the innovation ecosystem. I'm going to turn it back over to Jamey.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the juxtaposition, both content-wise on the state capacity versus the business sector contribution, but also the style you two interweave your presentation is brilliant. I really enjoy that. Thank you, Stephanie and Jamey, on this. Right. So I will start with a question and then ask John for the audience question. Maybe I'll start from the last one, the partnership here, right? I think both of you highlighted the need for collaboration between different sectors. But at the same time, the market-driven private sector innovation still very much heavily rely on competition rather than cooperation here, right? So between the two, how should the public entity navigate the tension between foster an open innovation system while still respecting the competitive incentive that drives the private sector innovation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll take a first stab at it. A lot of the time, both at the US DOT and at the state DOT, we talk a lot about trying to be neutral with regard to specific companies, specific technologies, right? But create the space to bring people in. So when I was secretary in Massachusetts, there's no approved way for autonomous vehicle companies to do on-road testing in Massachusetts. We needed to come up with a set of viable rules that would protect safety and acknowledge the role that local government had in owning the roads. And so it wasn't about should Waymo be able to test or should what was then Aptiv or New Mobility be able to test, but like what were the criteria that the government would use to approve a pilot? What was the data that we would expect to be shared as a condition of being able to test an autonomous vehicle on our roads? But then apply it to any company or any technology that could meet them. So I think government is not necessarily the right partner to like pick winners and losers is usually the phrase that's used. Like that's usually where government gets in trouble. But what we can do is create a playing field for testing, innovation, access to infrastructure, and then open it up to all the players in the field on an equal basis.
So the part that I want to add to this, and often with a lot of the companies that I work with and our model is, I think this is really being place-based is important. So in order to engage, and that's part of, I think, the overall sort of philosophy of the presentation today. If you're a business and you really want to work in the streets and get access to the curb to sample or try to demonstrate a product, it's really important not just to go to the operational or the streets agency of the city or the DOT, because they are managing a very busy operational system every single day. You really want to also engage the economic development and workforce development and other attributes of state government or local and city government. And it's really important to be a community member as a business, because the willingness to do what Stephanie just covered is really there's a multiplier effect when you really feel like you have engagement in the community and you understand the community's needs. And so the willingness to create sort of a model for individual companies is really those companies really feeling engaged in the community and not being just sort of forum shopping for a place to test. And then also organizations like mine are here to try to help do that on a scalable, repeatable model, right? So that there's more access to those kind of opportunities and that there's more of an economic development story, not just a transportation story there. So that's the added component that I think we have learned from other sectors, is to not look at this as purely as a policy question, but look at it as an economic development story.
I see. Thank you both. Yeah. Next question is about the infrastructure development, right? We know transportation system often calls for infrastructure that is both substantial and upfront, right? And also takes a long horizon to develop, design, and build. But the technology at the same time, as you mentioned, are changing very rapidly, right? So often there's a risk of, from one side, we want to build the infrastructure urgently. At the same time, there's so much uncertainty on the technology trajectory there, right? So how do you think we can reconcile this? Maybe you could use any particular system like electric vehicle charging system. It seems we're not that successful in building this, right? Yeah. How do we really balance between the two?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And again, I think it's a balancing act for government between jumping in so early, right, that we make the wrong decision or we miss a coming innovation. So with respect to electric vehicle charging, which was included in the bipartisan infrastructure law for the first time, when Federal Highway was writing, so Congress told Federal Highway, before you give out any money to state DOTs to pay for EV chargers, there needs to be a basic rule that sort of lays out parameters, right? Like what percentage of the time is it going to be up and how is it going to accept payments? And do you have to be, can you require membership in order to use an EV charging, or does it have to be open? And so that took about a year for Federal Highway to do it. And we made the decision that we wanted to use, we didn't want to support proprietary, so it had to be an open source, basically, form of innovation. But, and this goes to your point, Jinhua, about technology changes, the regulation did call out a specific kind of connector, which was the standard in Europe and was becoming the standard in the US, called CCS. And at the time, Tesla was not open source. It was a proprietary system. And so we didn't have to think about Tesla chargers because they didn't meet the statutory criteria of being non-proprietary. Then Tesla said, oh, we're willing to open up, right? And go through Underwriters Lab and have non-Tesla owners fuel, while Tesla owns the majority of the EV charging stations on the planet. So that's a huge plus for the government. But having written it into a regulation, right, that excluded Tesla, it means you have to go back through the entire regulatory process to, even though everyone agreed in substance, once Tesla had opened it up and made it non-proprietary and gone through UL certification, that the right answer was you should be able to build compatible ones. And car companies were announcing that they were going to use Tesla-style connectors. We have to go through the regulatory. So this goes to Jamey's point, which is you don't want to jump in too early, because you'll miss technology trends. But if you wait too long, you're also not sending a signal to the market about where investment should go. So it's hard, and I'm not going to tell you that the government always gets it right.
I think, though, that one additional component here, again, just trying to sort of add a different vantage point. Because of that struggle, I think this is where, just use the charging example, charging infrastructure example, there are significant private sector contributors that can also help to shape some of those early decisions, either by being a first buyer or also contributing to some of those early stage infrastructure investments. Again, your big property owners, some people who have big physical plants, including universities. There is an opportunity for them. They both need to and want to be the beneficiaries of some of these changes, whether they are either vehicle based or changes in some of the charging technology or some of the other things we're talking about. They are downstream of it, are going to want the benefit of it, get the benefit of them, and have requirements to adopt some of these. But they equally can play a vital role in these partnerships that we are trying to nudge along here by actually front-running government away and being an early stage, either private site adopter or contributor or tester. And that's exactly the model that we have built with my organization by partnering with BXB and having a site where we can begin to do some of those things where appropriate. And so I think that, again, it's going to depend on the subsector. So there's really different needs when we're talking about, fuel, sustainable aviation fuel is really different than when we're talking about micromobility. There's going to be different things we need to do. But again, thinking systemically here, there are roles where the private sector can help accelerate either that curve or play first buyer or first contractor that benefits all people in that whole chain.
I see. Thank you. Maybe the last question from me, and give it to Jill. It's about the peer-to-peer learning that both of you touched upon, right? Either between private sectors or between state to state, or even internationally on this, right? So Stephanie, Jamey, I'd like to share some examples where you see such learning can be very effective. Also, maybe just one comment is that John and I often comments on when you visit Europe or Asia city, come back, from one side we get excited, so much amazing thing going on. The other side kind of so disappointed why we couldn't do it in the US, right? Yeah, there's a frustration of incapability to learn on this. I'd like to bring some example that you find exciting on this peer-to-peer learning.
Yeah.
Let you go, Jamey.
Sure. So one, I want to talk about the mindset there, and I think sort of an intuition that both you and John's experience or your point there is about, and then maybe sort of tee up some examples. Again, I think we have to remember always, it's something I think all of us know intuitively who are here on this this webinar. That what distinguishes our willingness, whether we're customer, user, rider, adopter, regulator, we all use the transportation and different parts of the mobility network on every given day. So when you say you go to another city and you come away excited, it's because that's exactly what either regulatory adoption or customer adoption is like. It has to be experienced. So one of the things that I think that, again, I have sort of brought this to light a couple different ways today is that insight is really critical, which is if you haven't written it, it's hard to kind of buy it. If it's hard to, if you the second you have e-bikes in our bike share system here in the greater Boston area, it dramatically opens up the aperture for people's experience. And so I think the key there is just experiential. Peer-to-peer learning, city-to-city learning happens the more that we can expose people to those different things. So,
yeah.
So
let me, go ahead. So here's a specific innovation that doesn't seem like a big innovation, but it is. So when you go to most of these Asian cities and European cities, and they have really good bus and tram systems, they usually load from the middle of a road, right? They're called center running. So there's one median in the middle, and you can board people going in both directions on the street. In the United States, we tend to put our bus lanes on the sides, which is much less efficient because with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the amount of width you need on a sidewalk to get someone in a wheelchair or mobility device onto a bus or a tram is significant, and you need to do it twice. If you do it in the center, it's more efficient. We had no center running transit, like pretty much in the United States. So when you want to talk to the MBTA in this case and say, you should try this, it's sort of like, I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what it feels like. I don't know how people cross the street. I don't know how it affects bus design because you kind of have to have doors on both sides. And so in that case, philanthropy and a nonprofit were able to organize a learning trip for MBTA and other officials to go. In that case, it was to Mexico City to just see how center running transit worked. And the truth is, we now have our first center running transit bus system in Boston on Columbus Avenue, and another one in construction to run from Lynn down to the Blue Line in Wonderland on a DCR-owned roadways. And I really think that as long as it took, it would have taken longer if people didn't have that opportunity. And so at the beginning, when we showed that ecosystem picture, we talked about that even though today we were focused on the role of the private sector and local and state government, academia and philanthropy can actually leaven that peer-to-peer learning, whether it's by holding a forum, whether it's by putting out a guidebook, or whether it's by sponsoring a trip where people can physically go and see an innovation in practice that is not yet in use. Because it does help pull down the barriers to people trying the first. It's very scary to be the first one, right? This is the thing about government agencies. There is a certain culture of risk aversion in the government because, you know, you can get in trouble. And sometimes people, to use a mobility expression, get thrown under the bus if they take a risk in government and the risk doesn't pay off. And so it's breaking through that barrier and convincing someone that they can adopt that innovation often involves the ability to feel it, taste it, touch it, and talk to peers about how adoption went and what they should be aware of. And the more we can do that, the faster I think we can adopt some of the best ideas from around the world.
And the follow-up on that is also, this is where at a state and local level, government funding is actually doing already some interesting things. And I think there's some more possibility to be creative with grant making. For instance, here in the Commonwealth, and we're seeing in other states, you know, there was both a recent request for information and there's a follow-on competition underway, or will be underway, through our Clean Energy Center for grants for test and demonstration sites. And again, it's building off the insight that what Stephanie alluded to is the experiential element is really critical for innovation in our mobility network. And so if we can build not on public spaces, because again, safety is critical and we don't want to necessarily front run some of this. This is where public funding can stimulate private early R&D and early test and demonstration, so you can have a place and a site and a method of doing that. There are places like this. You had an earlier session, I know, with M-City and the track there, which is a critical piece of infrastructure. And these pieces of infrastructure, if we network them and build them with private or academic sites, can really help to accelerate that learning curve that Stephanie alluded to. You don't have to get on a plane necessarily to learn it, and you don't have to necessarily go too far to bring stakeholders or investors or elected officials. All of that is critical in order to get approvals and growth in the public domain. And so, you know, it's something that, you know, Michigan Central has done extremely well. Our model here at Mass Mobility Hub, others who are in that ecosystem building, and what I sort of went through in some of my slides, that's core to it, is bringing that visibility near shore than having to go overseas to get it.
Thank you, Jamey and Stephanie. And then let me add the jump to it for the audience questions.
Super. Thanks so much. There were several questions in the chat about standards. And I know Jinhua touched on this already, but just to quickly read some of these questions, Abdel Muhammad asked, who should control the standards? Is it okay to have state level standards, or is a federal one better? Sal Tannenbaum asked, you know, doesn't a technology enabled ecosystem require a federal standard so that, say, cars can behave similarly when crossing state borders? And Rob Fellows said, I think there needs to be federal leadership to establish consistent communication standards, data definitions, decision rules. Am I wrong on that? Now, we touched on this, but I think, can we build on that a little bit? And in particular, there has been a lot of push to have kind of pilots, mobility pilots. And I wonder if you both have sort of ideas about, you know, we've done all of these pilots. What is successful? What's not successful? What have we learned? Where have been the challenges with respect to scalability of these pilot programs?
So I'll tackle the first part. Maybe Jamey can talk about pilots. So I talked about 3 buckets of innovation, and I think there's a difference in what the federal role is, right? So for infrastructure, what I tried to do when I was at Federal Highway, and actually my predecessor and successors did too, is to actually open up infrastructure construction standards to innovation by saying, if you're building an interstate, if you're building a higher speed access limited road, yeah, they all have to be the same all over the United States of America. But if you're building local, rural, or urban arterials, honestly, if one state wants to have 6 foot, as the minimum width for a bike lane, and another one wants to have 5, and one wants to use bollards, and another one wants to use, good, let 1,000 flowers bloom. It's the only way we're going to learn. So for infrastructure, I think right now we're in a good place, which is that Federal Highway is basically backed off on design standards for everything except limited access high-speed roads. That was my goal, and I think we've accomplished it. For the second bucket, which is fueling, there did need to be a federal overlay. Congress recognized that. They handed it to Federal Highway. As I said, the rule is not perfect. We need a better way of doing test and learn. The Administrative Procedures Act is a very clunky way to make rules in a rapidly changing environment. But at least there was an acknowledgement that, again, the car manufacturers need to know what kind of connector to put on their cars. You need to know that when you pull up to a charging station, especially one built with taxpayer funds, it's going to work. So there we need it. I think the hard category is technology. We've been trying to have a federally driven technology discussion. There was spectrum that was reserved for a particular technology that people thought was going to be the basis for a vehicle to infrastructure communication. The spectrum never got used. The FCC took it away. Now there's a different one. I just think the problem is that technology changes so fast that while in a perfect world, the federal government could accelerate innovation, if they pick the right one, they actually slow innovation if they pick the wrong one. And so I find of the 3 buckets, that's the hardest one to know how to do it, because there's clear benefits to having uniform standards, but the problem is the government isn't always as good as we should be at making sure that we're picking correctly. And Jamey, why don't you tackle the pilot question?
So the pilots, I think there are 2 steps that I would like to emphasize here. One I've talked about a little bit, which is using in the very early stage private coordination or private sites to start pilots as opposed to the public sector pilots. The core issue, though, and I think some of the chat that I've been able to see has touched upon this a little bit too, is we need to address some of the challenges of both procurement law and also sort of even public grant making, and how that can be a barrier for pilots, which can get funded through these mechanisms, but that don't really get fully either bought or adopted or contracted. And there's some learning and models on this, but this is really, I think, a significant area for opportunity for us to sort of develop some new models. So a couple quick things. There are some examples. One that I would call out is the Transit Tech Lab in New York, that has specific topical-based challenges with a commitment on a contract, and in New York City with the MTA for specific transit challenges. And what that is getting at, which I do think is really the model that we need to look further, is using both government but equally other philanthropic and other sources to stimulate more performance outcomes. So as opposed to just start a pilot but then be stifled by the procurement rules or systems for longer term or more material contracts, use performance-based outcomes to make big commitments on the back end. So you can connect private and venture capital funding with outcomes. So to use a very specific example, this was actually in the book that many of us are reading right now for Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, Abundance, the concept of advanced market commitments. And just in really short terms, if you take a topic like either sustainable asphalt or cement and make a government commitment to buy a large volume, if you achieve certain outcomes, can unleash that front end experimentation, funding, with a commitment for a contract on the back end. And so what really this is getting at, and I think what we really need to do at a state and local level is, one, make some innovations in our procurement and contracting rules to enable better purchasing of these things, and a commitment for government purchasing if outcomes are achieved on either safety or sustainability, and unleash some other, or enable some other participants, both on academia, the venture capital side, and in the philanthropic side, to do some early stage testing and funding, knowing that there is a prize or a grant or more significant than some of our lower grants at the beginning. In short, what we often ask people to do is spend a tremendous amount of time, money, and effort to compete for a $100,000 grant to stimulate a startup business, but then not have any follow-on funding or support to get over the contract hurdle with the public sector after that initial competition. So we want to kind of inverse that.
Yeah, I'll mention one other great example of a pilot. The key to pilots is do the pilot, figure out what you learned, and either decide you're going in that direction or not. Pilots usually never get connected to actual action. New York City has been doing a very thoughtful pilot around charging for micromobility vehicles to get around the issue of the battery fires that had become a substantial safety issue. And they sort of, if you think of it as a funnel, they sort of put some money on the street. They tested a few different technologies. Some of them were then given a second round of funding because they were working both from the perspective of reducing fires, and they worked for the bike messengers, and they worked for the streets and the city, and then some of them didn't. So you can also think about staging things, right? There's a concept in the state capacity world called test and learn, and that you want to do things in a try a little bit, and then learn from it, and then try it based on what you learn. And so I like the idea of test and learn better than the idea of pilots.
Excellent. Okay. How to pack in 5 questions in 43 seconds. Let's see. I would just, you mentioned procurement, Jamey, and I wonder if, Bill, do either of you have other things to add on what can be done to make government more agile, government here in the United States at the state level, but also federal and local level? Do you see like reform of procurement as one of the sort of top priority items?
Yes, but and again, it's so federal highway has a power that neither federal rail or transit has, and it's called special experimental projects. And it is literally a way of going to federal highway and say, I want to do the procurement differently. And there are now, I think, 16 active SEPs. And just to give you an example of an innovation that doesn't seem very innovative, but was a big deal. So a bunch of communities wanted to have local hire on projects that were federally funded. They wanted to get the double benefit of the infrastructure, but also of having local residents be the ones getting the infrastructure jobs. There was a huge concern at the federal level, both in Congress and in the agencies, that local hire would increase the cost of delivering infrastructure. So Congress said federal highway can do a SEP, a special exception to procurement for local hire, but they have to collect data on the bids and the costs and put out a report and learn whether or not it did. So federal highway during the FAST Act, the 6 years of the FAST Act, operated under that system. They approved a bunch of local hire agreements. They collected the data. It did not decrease the number of bids. It did not increase the cost of the infrastructure. And when we were negotiating the bipartisan infrastructure law with Congress in 2021, we took that data to Congress, and they moved local hire out of being a SEP and into a always allowable procurement option for both federal highway and federal transit. So now anyone who gets highway or transit money can choose that they want to have a local hire requirement. So we got procurement rules changed by doing a test and learn thing. And that to me is it takes time, right? Because you have to do 6 years under the test mode. But by combining the test mode with real data gathering and presentation, and then looping back to the policymakers with that data, we actually were able to get a pretty fundamental change made in procurement rules. That's really important to a lot of communities. And I think we can do that. So we need procurement reform, but I do think because most procurement rules are there for a reason, usually concern about waste, fraud, and abuse, nepotism, and risk, we're not gonna change the rules for $600 billion worth of federal funding at once, right? We're gonna take pieces of it and give it a try.
I will just say really fast when it comes to two different concepts, and we use them both. One is from a procurement, probably even more aggressive, yes, in innovation, and also finding ways to experiment with some of the new models. Stephanie touched on that a little bit. The second, but equally important side, which is sort of mirrors procurement, is really public grant making, which we have a lot at a state and local level, and obviously there's federal grants as well. They're also a big proponent of rethinking that. I don't think public grant making is really to stand in the shoes of venture capital and picking winners or successes. And so I think we can use things like pre-qualifications, AI reads with a human backup. There's a lot of innovative ways to accelerate the decision, meaning if it takes a tremendous amount of time and a tremendous amount of work to get to an evaluation on who wins a grant, then I don't think we're accelerating up that S-curve. I like to find some really creative ways to get grants without government being in a judgment mode about what winners are, to people who beat minimum qualifications.
Great. Yeah, sorry to cut in here. We're running out of time now. But Stephanie and Jamey, thank you for the dynamic interaction between you two, and the answer on the question is really fantastic. Everybody, please join me. Thank Jamey and Stephanie for today's presentation.